Good morning. Good morning, Facebook. Good morning. Good morning, YouTube. Good morning. Good morning. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey. Good morning. Today is Friday, February the 8th. I can't believe this month is going by as fast as it is. Oh my gosh, we're already into the second month of the new year. And again, it's Black History Month, and all month long, I have been, this is the second week that I've been rocking a head wrap representing Black History Month. Let's see where my trusty co-hosts are this morning. Let's see who's here. I think David is on time. Let's see. There he is. Good morning, David.
Hey, everybody. I managed to do it. I managed to overcome my Technoramus challenges, and I'm here and very pleased and unstressed. Well,
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
No, David, we appreciate you. You're getting better and better. There she is. There's the beautiful Robby Caban. Good morning, Robby.
This is good for my self-esteem. No, thank you.
You are
Shealey. Thank you. It's embarrassing too.
How are you?
Hi, David. Good morning, David. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, Robby and David. I'm rocking another head wrap representing Black History Month. I had the most interesting conversation with my son yesterday. You know, it's amazing. Your children teach you things sometimes. I never stop learning, and it's just amazing to be a parent. I love it. But yesterday I had a conversation with my son, and he was talking about the do-rag and the hoodie, and with me having been wearing a do-rag. Do you know what a do-rag is?
Yeah, I know what a do-rag is. And what was the other thing you said?
A hoodie.
A hoodie. Oh, a hoodie. Oh, a hoodie.
Yeah. What's a do-rag, David? Let me see if you up on your Black culture.
You want me to define it?
Yeah, tell me what it is, David, and don't you dare Google it.
I remember people look when I was growing up. You know, Malcolm X has a story in his autobiography about the conch. You know what a conch is?
Oh yeah, of course I know what I'm listening to you. You're gonna tell me what you know.
Well, that burning lye to straighten your hair, you wrap it up and that in a handkerchief kind of thing, right? And that's do-rag, isn't it?
Yeah, well, kinda. That's a do-rag.
Okay.
You're in the ballpark, but a do-rag is it's a piece of cloth that the young guys, and I remember this from the 80s because it's like they think they're doing something brand new, but they're not. Like they've done this before, so they take and put this rag on their head. It ties around.
Yeah.
Then you tie it around multiple times, as many times as it does to tighten your hair and to cause you to have waves. So my younger son is sporting his waves these days, so he's been wearing his do-rag. But what I wanted to tell you with the conversation I had, David and Robby, was that do-rags and hoodies, they were talking about this at his high school, and they one of the teachers mentioned that they may be implementing a policy where the students can't wear do-rags and hoodies to school. And my son was a little disturbed because as he and the teacher started talking a bit more, he found out that they associated the do-rag and the hoodie with crime.
Right.
And I had to have the conversation, which he already knows the story of Trayvon Martin, but I had to have that conversation with him again and help him to bring it full, to see this thing in a bigger perspective, that we as a people, Black and brown people, we have our own style. We have our own way of expressing ourselves. And sometimes it comes in different forms. And, me with the hair wrap this month, this is cultural, it's ancestral. This is, who we are as African people. And I'm representing, and for the young people today wearing their hoodies and wearing their do-rags, which I don't really like the do-rag. I just don't like the look of it, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it if they want to wear it. So just talking about, things that make us all different, but we have to learn to embrace our differences and not criminalize, the look of Black and brown people. Robby, I know you know all about that living in Southwest Atlanta.
I do, and it's interesting because of my light skin privilege, I see things when I'm among folks who are obviously darker. I almost see the I know I do see. I see the difference in how people are responding and how people are treated. Mm-hmm. So if I'm alone or if I'm among people who, are all Caucasian, our service is different. The way people engage is different. The way people get treated is different. And then if I'm among folks who are all of a darker hue and I'm kind of the only one there, it's a whole different story. And I've even seen people get, police profiled and seen innocent people arrested, actually. And me being just associated, I was also arrested. So I actually, I sued for that and I won. But that's not to say that everyone can do that. That's not to say that everyone will win, because despite, the courts supposedly being, impartial with, our courts being blindfolded, that's supposed to be the vision, and there's justice in the courts. The truth of the matter is the courts are, quite compromised, because those are also appointed positions, and they tend to be hostile to just citizens and very pro-corporate. Mm-hmm. So that's just because I won doesn't mean everyone can. There's, we see that every day.
Yeah. David, you read about it, but you lived on Martin Luther King Boulevard, so you've had the experience.
I've had, I really resonate with that, Robby, because I was both acutely aware of the ways in which racial privilege allowed me to move more freely in the neighborhood, right? And at the same time, there were things about being in that geographic location. In other words, where I had no control over the general environment that was around me. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've just, if we're gonna take, I could take 30 seconds to say this. Martin Luther King Drive is the main thoroughfare, and it was just south of the apartment complex where I lived. Just north of the apartment complex was Interstate 20. All right. Now, there almost everywhere along Interstate 20, there are these concrete walls, that are sound barriers. You know what I'm talking about? Every interstate has sound barriers. This stretch on Martin Luther King Drive of about 2 miles, where there are these poor working class people of color apartment complexes, there are no sound barriers. So what that means is that the interstate, the noise from the interstate, the trucks and everything that's going by, is completely unblocked. And so it was like living where I lived was like as if you were broken down on the side of the road of the interstate trying to change a tire. Right. That's how loud it was. And the kids of in that apartment complex played in that noise. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And noise pollution is a real stressor for everybody, particularly for kids. So that's an example of the ways in which the racial inequalities play themselves out. Anyway, just one anecdote out of many. I got to write this up sometime because it's filled with stories like that.
There was a recent article about minority communities, Black and Brown, Black and Latino, getting like a ridiculous percentage more of pollution, of intake of pollution, just because usually the industries are placed in those communities where there's less, control over what goes there, and it's more chaotic. So people, obviously, businesses take advantage of that. And that's why this real estate component is so important. I had the privilege of being on a show this week, national, with Egberto, who I think is tuning in.
Yes.
And he brought up the correlation, and we could talk about this for hours, but the wealth building that occurs in real estate is so important, and the tax break that we get. And again, those numbers among minority communities are so low, and the generation, because of the setup and the system of our history, or what has happened in history, generations from prior can use that wealth and continue this program. And if you didn't have that same history, which obviously, you know, minority communities don't, you can't continue that same program. So you're not starting from a level playing field. And in fact, the cycle of low income or poverty actually gets worse in that same vein. Instead of improving, you know, and generating more wealth, you actually lose wealth. And the component with real estate is really important, because what people tend to not see is they associate crime, to your point, Tamara, or associate things with crime. It's embedded in our language, you know, blackballed, blacklisted. I mean, you can find a myriad of examples, but in essence, really the truth of the matter is gentrification to some degree is a form of violence. It's a violence on poor and divested communities, and the response is what's occurring. And instead, it doesn't have to be that way. Instead of investing in our folks to have healthy communities where we can all win, we're coming down with enforcement and police, you know, criminalization. And it's a mistake. It's not the right way to go at all.
I want to mention something here, because I think that we need to complicate the social relations. And one of the things that I keep pointing out is this concept of the 9.9%, the people who are below the 0.1%, who are really the rulers of this country. And I think that there really is a very big difference between the class benefits. All right, class benefits that the 9.9%, these are the people who are the real middle class. They're the class between the elite and the working class. That's the vast majority of us. And those people actually get benefits out of the system. Mm-hmm. Working class whites do not get benefits. Mm-hmm. They get privilege. But it is a racial privilege that actually renders them more powerless, because it separates them out from the rest of the working class, which is people of color. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. So as long as in the working class, mm-hmm. and this term middle class has been used to distract us from mm-hmm. from class consciousness. Mm-hmm. As long as we are fighting among ourselves, mm-hmm. and where the European Americans, thinking and acting white, think that they're getting benefits, that leaves the 9.9% to do the bidding of the 0.1%, because there's no power mm-hmm. to go against mm-hmm. that. And we could see it all in the entire range of benefits that the 9.9% get. They also essentially run the country for the 0.1%.
Well, I think, David, what you're saying is important, because you're saying it's really an illusion to some degree of privilege. Yeah. But nonetheless,
racial privilege is an illusion. The benefits of racial privilege are an illusion. The benefits
to a degree, because nonetheless, being someone who can pass, I know I get privileges that, I saw it even in high school. Yeah, my teachers treated me better. Because I went to school in a public school with a lot of minority children. My best friend, who's obviously darker than I was accused of not writing her papers when she did. And she just, she had aunties, who helped her. But I never was accused of anything like that. Yeah. I was kind of a pet, because I was more relatable. In the sense that I appear non-threatening because of what Tamara was speaking about, the association, and again, it's so ingrained in our language that it's unconscious to a degree. But really, for people, who have privilege like us, David, to really be allies, we have to acknowledge that. We have to.
Comment that is on another Facebook page where I've shared our broadcast, and Ken Williams says white privilege is essentially hitting the lottery. Let's not undersell what privilege has granted white, low-level, poor, and economically depressed white folks.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, they're to some degree exploited. White poor people are exploited just the same, and I think that's David's point, by the 1% and the 9%. But there's a benefit in that, you might get offered a job because of that connection. You're not seen immediately as a criminal because of that connection. But there is obviously a lower class, among white people in terms of income, and they can be demonized in similar ways, whether it's calling people white trash or rednecks, or I don't know all these things. I'm sorry, because I grew up here, but I'm not around that, so I don't know. Everyone else probably knows.
Mm-hmm. He says again, he's writing comments on another page. Ken, if you're watching, go to Tamara For Georgia page and start commenting there so we can see your comments and we can actually post them on the screen so that everybody can see them. So go to Tamara For Georgia right there on Facebook. But I'm gonna read his next comment. He says, for those economically depressed white folks, they see division in color from the poorest and richest of black folks. We need to see the reality of racism and why white folks protect at all costs.
And why white folks protect
at all costs. He's saying they're protecting racism at all costs. Protect
their privilege. Protect their privilege is the way that I would describe it. And I think there's this is the tension. This is the dynamic and I would say creative tension that we need to have the conversation about, because while European American working class people are privileged, they are also exploited. And while African American and other people of color are oppressed, they are also exploited. And it is, you have to maintain the tension between those two, that we have a common interest in fighting exploitation, and but at the same time, we have to acknowledge the divide and acknowledge the inequality that exists in the power relations, not because European Americans actually get something out of it, but they are delegated the responsibility, quote unquote, by the elite to enforce the color line. And for European American working people, the color line is the only thing they've got.
Well, no. They do get something out of it economically. And this is why. And I agree with you to a degree, David.
Yeah.
When I see I was at ARC the other day, the Atlanta Regional Commission, and I was downtown, and they have been doing construction on this building off of Peachtree for over a year, because I went to the ARC last year and it was still getting worked on. And whenever I go there, that construction contract, everyone there was Caucasian, down to the foreman, so on. And I noticed that a lot when it comes to large scale construction contracts. Now, when I see people working on homes or smaller scale, not in the city, everyone is Latin and or a minority. And so there is there's a privilege beyond, being white. I mean, there's a benefit, there's a value. When you see, unionized workers to some degree, it's the truth. And we have to acknowledge that and be very intentional about it to be true allies. And actively, and the thing is, just because you have privilege doesn't mean you can't be an ally. We just have to be intentional, acutely aware, acknowledge, and our actions have to reflect where we are actively trying to make a difference to the opposite, not complicit by inaction or by not getting involved. Mm-hmm. And I would like to add, make no mistake about it. If people can pass and they open their mouth in the wrong way or step out of line, you're out of it. you no longer get the benefits. You're cut out. And that's for white people too. David, I'm sure you've lost probably business or friends and so on because you talk about certain things that you're not supposed to. You're breaking an unspoken code.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just wanted to mention something about winning the lottery. What is your friend's name who's on the we can't see his
Ken, he's actually going to join us on the broadcast. Robby, is this your Ken Williams from the cafe?
Oh, I don't know. Let's bring him on. If it's, I'll recognize him right away. I know it's. I don't remember.
Williams, what is his name?
Ken.
Ken. I would disagree about using that metaphor about the lottery, because in fact the lottery is a way of redistributing income from the poor to the rich. It is an indirect tax, like a sales tax, and so for all working people, the lottery is actually another of these illusions. And the same is true for home ownership for working class people. Home ownership for working class people it is true that for some working class people there is there he is. Hiya, Ken.
Ken, welcome to the broadcast. Thank you. We were, those comments were interesting, so we definitely wanted to bring you on and give you an opportunity to address us and address the audience directly. Thank you for joining us.
Sure, no problem. Let me just figure out where I put you so I can pull it back up again. Here we go. Yeah, thank you for having me. I just wanted to go and make sure I highlight the fact that, whenever we're talking about phone's down here. Whenever we're talking about the history of America, the impact that color has had on Black people versus white people, ever since the very beginning, America was founded with poor whites coming to this country and finding their privilege gave them the advantage of making sure that they weren't placed into the same classification as Black people who had to do all the work. The white folks were able to go and benefit by extraordinary wealth. The Black folks, for several hundred years, were systemically depressed, oppressed, placed into fear by gunpoint, and controlled without being victimized by crime based on the colorization of their skin. So this whole thing about race and the difference between classism and all that stuff, yeah, it matters, because we have built a system in America where the darker the skin color, the fewer the opportunities you had to escape this system of chattel slavery. The lighter your skin hue, the chances of you escaping it were greater. The whiter you are, or the whiter you were, the chances of being able to break free from the whole oppressed system of being economically depressed as well as being depressed as a human being was greater. We're still living and surviving in that system today. So we cannot mischaracterize what's going on in America. It has everything to do with color. And it has everything to do with the fact that since 1964, we've now transitioned into equal opportunity and trying to make sure that in certain activities, we level the playing field. But make no mistake about it, we're still living in that same system. It's just that the rules have changed slightly. And when we have Black people who are 50 years post 1964 that are now the first college graduate or the first president or the first CEO or the first person to do something that white folks have enjoyed a privilege of being a part of for several hundred years, we have to close the gap and have a real discussion about the disadvantages that are Black and white are economic, period. And that is the reason why I think, although these colorful conversations are great, they still don't strike to the core of what the real problem is. If someone stole 400 years worth of wealth from me, and then all of a sudden you say, okay, here goes your freedom and catch up, I'm not going to be able to catch up because your purse is carrying around all my wealth. So there are a whole bunch of issues here that in America we need to discuss. And some of that has to go and circulate back to reparations, because every other group in this society that has been classified as a prisoner of war has received some form of reparations. The only people that have not been classified as prisoners of this war and were there for several hundred years are Black people, and have never been classified as prisoners of war, but it was a race war. And because we had this race war going on, we have this divide, this separation in economics that is a chasm. We cannot bridge the gap if someone else is walking around with all the proceeds from ancestral wealth. That is the reality that we need to deal with.
I don't disagree with Mr. Williams at all. In fact, I think there's to add to that, there's a argument that is why divested communities should receive a public-private partnership and funding from the city and federal funding to improve their districts, because the balance is so unequal. But I would like to add that when Mexico was at war with the US and lost land and lost lives and had prisoners, I don't believe they received reparations.
Well, you're talking about that's a country. I'm sorry, you're talking about in certain timelines of the history. If we start from the very beginning of the history, there are 13 colonies. Those 13 colonies came here, and they were under the guidelines of the crown over in Europe. Then all of a sudden there was a separation in the timeline, and every colony began to form its own constitution. Those constitutions from those colonies dictated what life would be like for the citizens of each of those colonies. Then all of a sudden, those colonies formed a union contract that became the United States. They all agreed to certain terms and conditions under a contract. The contract then branched out to where we now have many states in the United States that have formed their own contracts, but they all are represented by the union. What I'm trying to say is that regardless to how we parse that out, the problem still becomes from 1776, after the Declaration of Independence, all the way up to 1865, to the federal government finally abolishing slavery throughout the entire Union. Black people throughout this entire timeline were faced with the same standards wherever they went. They were Black. And before 1776, it wasn't even just color. It was the bloodline that became recognized as being what was going to be disparaging towards people of color versus people who are white. So that's the reason why today we can talk about, I'm lighter than you, or I'm darker than you, and that I can pass and this and that. These are all old terms that are recycled since the very beginning of a system that racially profiled Black people, criminalized them based on the color of their skin, and privileges were extended to people who did not have my bloodline. That is a crime, and that is the reason why it's a human rights violation. And that is the reason why when we fast forward to today and we're talking about living in the vestiges of the system, we cannot treat it or mischaracterize it for what it was. All of these people who were my descendants were prisoners of a system to benefit only one group and one group only, and that were white folks. And until we say it exactly as it is and as it was, we can't get to the heart of the issue, which is, how do we correct it?
Yeah, I agree.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I just know that there's other groups also in those positions. Puerto Rico is a perfect example. Tainos are the original indigenous to the island. Colonized, less than 1% of the bloodline remains. Africans were brought through. Obviously, you've described that very well with the history. But there's a complete disenfranchisement of Puerto Ricans, period. And I want to make sure that we create alliances and recognize an intersectionality, because you can have, as you described, multiple layers that are going to impact your life. Being a female is a component of that. Being a Black female is a even more challenging component. And whether it's light skin or dark skin, you're correct. The darker the skin, but then adding a female component and then adding a class component, now you're really in a spot. probably the worst spot there could be. Hence, why Latina and Black women make the least amount income-wise than anybody.
That's correct.
Right.
And that's because the society was built on white men having all of the power and controlling every other person within it. However, within that division, there were classes of people that, although white women may have been classified as being less than their white male counterpart, they still benefited from the same system that the white men created. Black people, whether you were a black child, black man, black woman, never benefited from the system. And all of these amendments that we have to laws, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, were to try to promote change in environmental beliefs that were becoming criminalized, prohibiting certain conduct. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is not just about the equality for black people, it's for white women, black women, Latino women. It's for a whole class of people that did not fare or have the same advantages that white men had in a certain playing field, economic playing field, educational playing field, hospitalization, all types of activities that people were being disenfranchised with that who weren't white and men. But make no mistake about it, white women who were next to white men benefited from the system as is, as they do today, even though we're beyond the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So yes, there are certain alignments that are necessary to go and bring down the systemic problem that is going back to the very beginning of the relationship. But at the same time, once we make these alliances, we cannot somehow forget the fact that certain people have had a very negative experience and still continue to have a very negative experience. 1 in 5 black men today, since the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, have been incarcerated based on low-level possessionary offenses that similarly situated white men, white women have not been negatively impacted by. So we still have a recycling of the same system framed completely differently for the enrichment of white people. Criminal justice has negatively impacted black folks and brown folks more than it has white people similarly situated. And how can that be if we've grown the law enforcement back in 1960s after the monumental civil rights era? Law enforcement in America had 200,000 law enforcement officers. We have well over 1 million today since the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. How is it that law enforcement, without getting together in one room to have a common conversation about how to go and pass policies, practices, and procedures, somehow throughout this entire land found themselves to target, selectively enforce laws on black and brown people, but exonerated white people? That is not unconscious bias. That is racism and discrimination.
Ken, are you with Cafe?
I wanted to just read you something.
Before you jump in, David. Ken, are you with Cafe Ulu?
I'm not.
Okay.
What was that?
Go ahead, David.
No, I didn't hear what you said.
I was asking him another question. Go ahead and make your point. Egberto is in the lobby, so we're going to bring Egberto in. Ken, I want to thank you for joining us on this broadcast. I'd like to definitely talk to you a bit further. I think that you added some insight and some things to this conversation, and we would definitely want to have you back again. So thank you for joining us on this broadcast, Ken, and we're going to have you back.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. Okay, David, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I wanted to respond to some of the things that Ken was saying, because I think that one of the issues here that we ignore over repeatedly is the power relations that exist between African American working class people or working class people of color and European American people, working class people. The only power, and this is what Ken, I think, is focused on, and I think to the disadvantage of understanding how we can change things, is power over. It is a delegated power from the ruling elite. They do not have power to improve their own lives. That is European American working people. let me just read a quote here, and this is a quote from Frederick Douglass. It's something that nobody ever quotes Frederick Douglass about, except my former mentor, Ted Allen. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, says, "The slaveholders, with a craftiness peculiar to themselves, by encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, succeeded in making the said white man almost as much a slave as the black slave himself. The difference between the white slave and the black slave was this: the latter belonged to one slaveholder, while the former belonged to the slaveholders collectively." So that is what he goes on to say is that the slaveholders, and by that the ruling elite, because they were the dominant elite in the 1840s and 50s, succeeded in cultivating the enmity of the white worker towards the black as men rather than as slaves, so that they saw themselves as having a stake in the slave system, that is, white working people, and because they were threatened by the competition of slave labor. But in fact, they were actually being reduced by the competition of unpaid labor, so that they were actually impoverished by that competition. The only solution to that was the abolition of slavery and putting people African Americans on equal footing with themselves. And so Frederick Douglass understood that. And in fact, so did Martin Luther King. King talked about
David, Egberto just joined the broadcast. We're going to let him hop in real quick with his national update. Egberto, did you hear our conversation this morning? It was deep.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed it. It was quite good, and I like the corollary that David ended there with, because that is a very insightful point. I didn't know that Frederick Douglass said that, but it's amazing that we can use that today with the way we have the way the plutocracy has control over the system, the way Donald Trump, as the head of the plutocracy today, is actually splitting people up to effect that exact enmity that he's talking about. So I mean, I think that circles around greatly what Ken has been saying. I mean, you put that all together and you have the solution. I mean, I have always thought that the master really being the slave, because here's the deal, even in today's world, right? All of us that are the ones that are actually doing some work, let's say someday we decide, hell, we're not going to do it anymore. The master doesn't know how to do it. The master doesn't know how to cure. The master doesn't know how to sweep. The master doesn't know how to cook. The master doesn't know how to do anything. The master is completely dependent on those he called the slaves. So who are the ones really in power? Now, when I'm talking about my issues, I always try to remind most Americans of that reality. The reality is all of us have worth, and no one has more worth than the other. And society puts all that worth together so that we all make life easier for us all.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Egberto. What's going on the national front? You like
Medicare for all. Medicare
Yes.
for all. The fight is on.
Yes.
What I'd love to tell your entire audience, my dear friends, Robby, David, Tamara, let me tell you something, guys. We all have to engage in this battle, because as it turns out, even the Democratic side of the aisle, they're starting to play games. So what we have to be doing is we have to go out there and first I don't want to say educate, because I don't want to sound presumptuous. What I want to say is we need to enlighten every American to understand that the only solution to our current medical problem, our current healthcare issue, is to have a system where there is one payer, more efficiency, and that then covers all. And the second item I'd like to add to that is that we have to, each of you have a home. each of you pay something called property taxes on your home. Your property is your wealth. What that means is you pay a wealth tax that a billionaire can stock away hundreds of billions of dollars away completely, entirely, sitting down without anybody taxing it. Is simply wrong, simply sad, and it simply says we, the average people, are paying more taxes in the aggregate than they are. Therefore, when we have somebody like the former CEO of Starbucks says it's un-American to tax wealth, no, we do it right now. So what we need to do is tax their wealth because they have unjustly accumulated all that wealth on our backs. In saying that, Medicare for all, there is a way to pay for it, and that is to make sure we tax fairly, tax their wealth.
There it is.
There is the national news.
I think that, yeah, I think, Egberto, that there's a couple of things to add to that. I agree with you about this notion of the wealth tax.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things about Medicare for all, or a universal health insurance system, is that it creates a unified risk pool.
Amen.
And what a unified risk pool means is not only greater efficiency for understanding the costs and and billing and all of these other things. A few years ago, Barbara Ehrenreich pointed out that the health insurance industry employs 300,000 people who are primarily in charge of finding ways to avoid paying health insurance, all right, to their insurees. Okay, so we have the built-in contradictions and irrationalities of the system go very, very deep. Those are people who are in the healthcare business whose sole purpose is to prevent the rest of us from getting our health insurance. Now, if you have a system where everybody is in the same risk pool, what you are doing is creating a solidarity system, right? In which another person's health and your health are you have an interest in maintaining their health, so that the whole orientation of the healthcare system becomes towards prevention.
David, I am glad that you mentioned that stuff about risk, because I didn't really want to go there with risk. I didn't know how in detail our technical folks wanted to get on this particular show. But here's the deal: that's the only excuse health insurance companies had for their existence in the first place. They manage risk, and you could get a different set of rates because each person who managed risk in a particular manner, that's their risk pool. And that is how the bastardization of the American population came, where we left a whole lot of sick people out. So it's great that you brought up that issue on risk pools, etc., because that is what we want to have, the American risk pool. And if you have the American risk pool, that immediately tells you don't have any need for all the duplicative nature of several insurance companies with several CEOs, with skimming, all that. Exactly. We can get rid of all of that together. But David, here's the deal. Tamara, here's the deal. The Robby, here's the deal. In each of our platforms, we have to be the ones who can break this down in a manner that the average American citizen can understand. Because what's happening right now is there are institutes that were formed with the sole intent of misleading Americans as follows. There are two things that they're going to use. They said they're going to use number one, they're going to tell Americans that, hey, you are going to lose the health care that you like. And since most Americans don't really use their health care, they think they like the health care that the health insurance that their companies are providing. The second thing that they said they're going to do is they're going to tell you, oh, but your taxes are going to go up. And I want everybody to be bold and say, yes, your taxes are going to go up. Your taxes will go up, but you now will have no co-pays. You now will have no deductibles. You now will have no premiums. And guess what that means? More money in your pocket.
Yeah.
And I think so. I don't think we need to lie to our folks. I think we need to, when the Republicans say your taxes are going to go up, say, yes, it is. But guess what? And when they say that you're going to lose your private health care, yes, you will. But guess what? You won't have those co-pays that your private health care has. It will be a lot better. And I think it's, if we take the narrative by the horns, I think we can make that difference.
Egberto, I think you're absolutely right. There's another aspect to this. When your insurance is no longer tied to your employer,
amen.
Right? When your insurance is a civil right, that is a right of a citizenship right, that means that you have more power in relation to your employer.
Right.
So solidarity that we build in a single risk pool has ripple effects on the power relations between bosses and workers, right? If you are no longer afraid to take the risk of starting a small business or moving from one job to another because you're going to lose your health insurance,
right?
You may decide, well, I'm going to stay. I'm not going to borrow money to do that small business, but you have much greater choice, much greater freedom of choice. So solidarity in one aspect actually puts greater weight in the working class, greater power in the working class in relation in this class struggle that's going on. So I agree with you absolutely, and that's another thing that we really need to communicate to folks.
There's also dangers in having. Sorry.
Go ahead, Robby.
There's also dangers in having healthcare associated with employers that can get really complicated. When your employer has access to your records, can cut off your benefits, it can really be used as a tactic. And again, because for an example in Georgia, right to work state, you don't have recourse unless you take it legally. And a lot of people cannot fight a corporation. And they're most likely going to lose in the court anyway, because the courts are hostile to employees and favorable to corporate.
Yeah. That's true throughout the legal system. So it's not just Georgia, and it's not just right to work states. It is really hard to do legal battle. It's extremely expensive and very risky. And particularly for working class people, for the 9.9% that I keep emphasizing, they do have access to legal representation. The rest of us,
but it's worse. It's worse than a right to work, because you can literally be escorted off property without any recourse. When people think it's true, you can't do it on the basis of discriminatory action, EEOC, the Equal Opportunity Commission. But what they don't realize is that you still can be fired. You just have to file your complaint, which takes years, and then take it to court, which you might lose, and still have an attorney, which you have to pay for.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's worse. It is worse. And I agree with Egberto. We need to be courageous about proceeding. But also, I hope we don't get caught in the trap of the divide and conquer. And this ties into everything, really. It ties into what you're saying, David. I agree with you, Egberto. Everybody has, but we do have privileges, and it's really hard to be allies if we don't acknowledge that.
I would love to address that, because you made a very, very, very important point, Robby. We can't divide and can't conquer. And what I'm trying to do, first of all, is with the little segment that I have, is try to get our as far as the progressive sides as united as possible. But I'm going beyond that. I am not using when I'm going to quite a few Republican events, and I'm not using let's say the terminology of I am super progressive necessarily when I'm there. I'm saying to them, your kids need health care, your folks needs, this is what, wouldn't this be better for you? And I gave a quick story that occurred at Starbucks when I sat down and I spoke to a woman, a Republican woman, and I started to describe Medicare for All, not by name, just by how it would work. And this woman, thinking that I was a Republican because I live in a Republican district, was eating it all up and agreeing. And I felt a bit guilty. So I finally said, ma'am, I just need to let you know that I am a left-wing progressive Democrat, but I just kind of wanted to say that. The woman turned around and she looked at me, red face. She said, but you're so nice. And then I said, no, I mean, but that just shows you the dynamics of ideology, right? Yeah. But later on, she comes into Starbucks and she'll always sit by me, friendly or whatever. But the thing about it is that seed was planted in her head. So Medicare for All, when it comes out, it's not scary to her anymore. And even if she can't wholeheartedly support it around her peers, in the booth, when she has the privacy of her vote, those are things that, people, people respond to.
Thank you, Egberto. We always appreciate you.
I agree with you.
Go ahead, Robby. Robby has more to say. Go ahead, Robby.
No, I was just going to try to tie it, because I agree with David. If poor working class white people, especially whether it's rural, were not suffering, they would not have bought into Make America Great Again. Mm-hmm. That's the truth about it. But we have to acknowledge that there are different levels of suffering, and poor minority communities really, it's a whole nother level. Not to say that the same people are not benefiting, and it's confusing for people, especially with two separate dynamics. We have our 1%, and then what David refers to as the 9%, who still receive a privilege from that 1%. And then they're considered this middle class, but really they're only 10% of the population. So that doesn't make sense. We're really leaving the 90% below that. And then you come to a city like Atlanta that is so racially divided, and you see people in charge, it can be a micro for the country. When we had Obama as president, you see, we've got a mayor named Keisha. Atlanta has a mayor named Keisha. We had a mayor named Kasim Reed. We've had Black leadership. And so that's challenging to process. And on top of it, I live in communities where a lot of our leadership who's Black is heavy on enforcement. They're the same people saying, arrest these people, call the cops on these people, on poor Black people. So you mix that up and people are it's difficult to process.
I love that you said that. And before I go, I just want to say one quick thing. And that is, on CNBC, the guy who founded BET, a Black guy, what I try to show is there's a dynamics of class as well. You could not tell based on what he has to say about capitalism, about income inequality on CNBC. You take the picture away, and you think he's just another white capitalist who really doesn't care about anybody else. And with that, that's I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. First, I want to thank you for joining us every week right here on this broadcast. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey. It's Tamara for Georgia. You can find Egberto at politicsdoneright.com. There it is right there on the screen, politicsdoneright.com. He is every day on his broadcast. Egberto, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so kindly for having me, Tamara. It's great to see you, Robby and David. Bye-bye.
Good to see you, Egberto. Yeah. Well, Robby, I think that there's a lot of ignoring of both the ways in which European Americans act as the deputies of the ruling elite, and at the same time the underlying common class interests that they have with people of color, and that's the nub of the issue. And if we can't hold those two seemingly contradictory thoughts in our head, I don't think we're ever going to be able to resolve the issues of power that we really need to address. Solidarity means power, and it's very different from acting as an ally of somebody else. An ally is somebody who has a convergence, a temporary convergence of interests. and there's a whole negotiation that goes on. Solidarity means something very different. It means that the underlying interests are the same, and we have it's a strategic partnership rather than a temporary alliance. So that's why I keep using that term rather than allies, because in fact it also comes down. It is more hard hitting towards white working people because and critical of what they're doing, because if they are doing what they are doing to their class brothers and sisters, then they're betraying their own selves. They're betraying their own interests. I read you that thing about Frederick Douglass. One of the things I wanted to add is this is from Martin Luther King in 1965, sorry, after the Selma to Montgomery march. He gave a speech in which he had these words to say about Jim Crow. It may be said that it may be said that the slavery era, that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores, on the streets, and in the public buildings. And his children, too, learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. So this is Martin Luther King.
On Jim Crow, David.
Huh?
Sounds like they were starving on Jim Crow. Starving
yeah, tawny bird that they were offered up as a substitute for wages. But once again, the poor white is actually dragged down by the oppression of the African American in the South. He's actually not benefiting, in any real material terms, he is certainly of a different status, of a higher status than the black working person. But it's not a benefit to be left. Here's another example.
Before you go into another example, Dave, we're 2 minutes away from the top of the hour. One second.
Yeah.
Lena has made a comment on one of the polls. She said the advantage of us Euro Americans is our white skin. So she's agreeing with you, David. But before we go, I just want to give a brief, quick update on the bills that are right here in Georgia. I always have to give you a legislative update. There's a lot of people watching this broadcast, and I apologize for the sun. Where I'm sitting, I think at a certain hour, the sun is going to shine in on this window. So if you can hear me, just let me finish out the broadcast with a legislative update. So just to give you an update, House Bill 120, just to kind of give you I like to show people that, in Georgia politics, there's never a dull moment. House Bill 120, Bell Forsyth Judicial Superior Court, they're wanting to increase the salary of their judges to $49,500 to be paid in equal monthly installments. So that's a bill right here in Georgia, HB 120, with the judges. The city of South Fulton, HB 121. They want to change their boundaries. Again, that's the city of South Fulton. That's a brand new city here in Georgia. It's a piece of legislation to change their corporate boundaries. House Bill 122 is a firearms bill. It looks like it is that campus carry bill. They're trying to revoke it. It is SB 50 and House Bill 122. Looks like they're initiating that bill in both chambers, in the House and in the Senate. And it's a firearms bill, Democratic bill to revoke the authorization of guns that are being carried on property and in schools. So take a look at that. Again, House Bill 122 and Senate Bill 50. I wanted to share, there's a city of Central, and I thought I had to look it up because I'd never heard of Central Hatchie, Georgia. Central Hatchie. Robby, I know that name is, I had to look it up just because I'd never heard of Central Hatchie, Georgia. So there's a town of Central Hatchie, Georgia. It's a small town. It's in Hurt County. It's West Georgia. I even had to look it up, Robby, because I was so interested to see where in the world was Central Hatchie, Georgia. Population in the 2010 census, 408 people. So there's some legislation to provide for a municipal court in Central Hatchie, Georgia. And there's another little town, Bowdoin, the city of Bowdoin. As of 2010, another West Georgia little town, little city. They had a population of 2,040 in the 2010 census, and they're wanting to have a municipal court as well. A couple more bills, and then we will close out for today. The Department of Labor, they want to create this Georgia Best program. I thought it was quite interesting because with this bill, it's the Labor Department shall be authorized to establish the Georgia Best program. It's a business employability skill training program intended to assist the state's existing and emerging workforce in developing employer identified skills needed to be successful in the workplace. And it was just interesting to me. And I'm like, so these employers now need training to be better employers. And it go on to say, such programs should provide an employability skill training curriculum that may include, but shall not be limited to, skills relating to punctuality, critical thinking, and the ability to work in a team. HB 126, y'all, just go check it out. I just thought, like, so we're going to spend money to train employers to be better employers. House Bill 126, take a look at it. I'm not going to say any more about it. House Bill 128, a couple more. It's a malpractice bill. It's with the insurance companies. And with this bill, it talks about medical payments and medical malpractice claims. The fox is watching the hen house. Go take a look at those of you that are watching insurance legislation or anything to do with the medical board. House Bill 128 was something I think somebody needs to take a look at. One more. I just think this will be my last one for the day. But House Bill 129. So it's about knuckles. If those of you know anything about those brass knuckles, it's about knuckles. So they want to be able to sell brass knuckles under the age of 18, because it's a law that you can't, under the age of 18, they can't buy knuckles. They just said knuckles. They didn't mention brass knuckles. But in this legislation, it wants to allow them to buy the 2-finger knuckles. And I had to look it up. What are these 2-finger knuckles? So they're kitty knuckles, right? So with these kitty knuckles, some of them are have their characters on them, like they're cats, they're dogs. You stick your finger in the knuckle part and it looks like a cat or a dog. And some of them have spikes on it. I'm like, so you want to sell these to children, to people basically kids under the age of 18.
Oh my God. House
Bill 129, y'all. So when I tell you there's never a dull moment in Georgia politics, there's never a dull moment. One more, and this will be the last one, I promise. But this one is about the horse racing is back. So Senate Bill 45, y'all, horse racing, and it's entitled Rural Georgia Jobs and Growth Act. Rural Georgia Jobs and Growth Act. But guess what? It's about horse racing. The Georgia Horse Racing Commission creating it, and the historic race wagering machines. So they're gonna have these machines that do horse racing, and is it live horse racing? But it's wrapped up in this act called the Rural Georgia Jobs and Growth Act. So go and take a look at it, y'all. Never a dull moment in Georgia politics. So I didn't mean to go too far, too long. Didn't mean to go over the top of the hour. But Robby and David, this has been a wonderful broadcast. Y'all. What you say, David?
I said, thank you, Tamara.
You're welcome. Robby?
Thank you as always. Thank you for everything you do, both of you. I'm so glad Ken came on. He had a lot of good info. I hope to hear from him.
Yeah, I look forward to us meeting him and talking to him further. Cafe Ulu, give the shout out, Robby.
Cafe Ulu in Sylvan Hills. I'm sad he didn't come on the show. We were doing live, right, on the 15th, the following Friday at 11. They've got a really interesting business model, Black owned, in town, 30310. It'll be next week.
Yes, we're going to be live, everybody. Facebook Live, YouTube Live. We're going to be live doing our broadcast next Friday at Cafe Ulu at 11 o'clock. We'll have more details in the feed and more details inviting you out to our first live broadcast at Cafe Ulu. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.